Welcome to Tales of American History, the Witnessing History Education Foundation podcast, educating Americans to understand the history of their country and of other countries so that they will appreciate the value of America's unique free institutions. I'm your host, Genevieve Brown, and today Kent Masterson Brown is speaking with our special guest, Jon Park. More about him in a minute, but first, become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org, the website of the Witnessing History Education Foundation. View for free the Foundation's documentary films on the website and on the Foundation's new YouTube platform. View also the Foundation's free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards, both on the website and at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook and Twitter. Now, take a journey back through time with Kent Masterson Brown and our guest, Jon Park, and let their storytelling transport you to the most compelling moments in American history. Originally from Springfield, Illinois, Jon grew up in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln, just 3 miles from Lincoln's home, and being surrounded by all that history has had a lifelong impact. Jon is the chairman of Kentucky's Independence Semi-Quincentennial Commission, preparing for celebrating America's 250th birthday. Join us to hear Kent, who serves with Jon on that commission, and Jon discuss some great moments and some great people from American history. Welcome, Jon.
Jon, listen, welcome. I'm glad to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Good. Jon, let me start with something about your background. You were born and raised in Springfield, Illinois.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Now, Springfield, Illinois, for those of our listeners who love history, immediately that name brings to mind Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
You were brought up in the shadows of Abraham Lincoln's home,
Yep.
of his law office, of the old state capitol,
Yes.
the old U.S. courtroom. And you were brought up not far from Old New Salem.
Correct. About 20 miles from there.
Which is near Petersburg,
Yeah.
Illinois.
Yeah.
And also all the courthouses where Lincoln practiced in the old 8th Judicial Circuit. And my memory, Metamora in Woodford County still has the original courthouse. Mount Pulaski.
Yeah.
In Logan County, along with Postville. Postville, I think, is a reproduction, but it still looks identical to the courthouse that once stood there. Then Beardstown, Cass County, and Decatur in Macon County.
Right.
All those still stand.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, Jon, what was it like growing up around all that?
It was the land of Lincoln, and it really was. My mom and dad instilled early on in us history, and of course, when it's Lincoln, we did everything. We did all the sites during the summertime. My mom would take us on field trips. As a family, we would do these things. We'd go out to New Salem. We'd visit the new state capitol, the old state capitol. Of course, during school, school field trips would go out to New Salem. And of course, they would have volunteers out there acting out, showing us how to make lye soap and doing the things that they did back there in New Salem back in the 1830s. And it was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it. I know history's not for everybody. It should be, but I enjoyed it. And what I couldn't get from the actually hands-on and visual stuff, this was back in the day before the World Wide Web and all those things. So we had the World Book Encyclopedia, and I wore out the letter L.
So did we.
Yes. So the letter L I wore out. You can see the spine is broke because I spent a lot of time reading about Lincoln. I spent some of the others too, but I'm just a big fan. Like you said, I grew up in the shadow of Lincoln, and I loved every minute of it.
What is it about Lincoln in your mind that makes his story so attractive?
I think it's this man who came from virtually nothing, and the fact that he where he was born in Hodgenville, the problems that he endured growing up, the relationship he had with his dad, and the death that he had to constantly deal with, the loss of his mother, and later on his sister, then when he got to New Salem, of course there's some debate there about Anne Rutledge, but the first love of his life and those things, and then later on when he's married to lose his three of his sons. All those things, and still he persevered. A man who had no formal education, a year, and to do all the things he did and becomes president of the United States and holds the nation together. I mean, that's a tremendous story.
It is a tremendous story for anybody
Yes.
to understand. Even if you don't want to know it for purposes of the history, to know it for the purpose, to use your word, of the perseverance of this person. And is that not a guide star for all of us?
Yeah.
Lincoln, he showed up at New Salem in 1830, and his first words out of his mouth to those with whom he spoke was, I showed up like a piece of floating driftwood, and which is pretty much all he was then. And I've always been stunned, John, that Lincoln, from 1830 until 1837, just 7 years, he moved from a position of being a piece of floating driftwood to a member of the bar of the state of Illinois.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it, all done by self-teaching. He had some people in Springfield who helped him, who later became law partners with him. But still, it was a drive to learn and to better himself. And boy, is that not a lesson for everybody?
Absolutely. I mean, he went out looking for a mentor, and he found one named Mentor.
Yes, he did. That's right.
And to do all that, and not only become a practicing member of a lawyer, but also ran for the state legislature, of course, twice. The first time he lost, but got back up, and 2 years later won. Failure after failure, and picked himself up and did it again and moved forward.
Right. And then, out there, it beyond being a member of the state legislature, he ultimately wound up in Congress in 1846, but then tried to run for he basically was not able to run for re-election because of positions he had taken.
Right.
So that kind of flopped. And then he runs for the United States Senate twice and fails in the 1850s. And yet that man becomes president of the United States in 1860.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know of anybody in memory of this country's story who ever did that, anything like it.
Right.
Well, he is a fascinating man. Tell me this, and tell our listeners this. What was it, if it was anything, being around the sites like New Salem, like the old state capitol, Lincoln's home, the law office? What was it that moved you about that story?
Well, it's just being there and being able to, and I realize a lot of New Salem is recreated, but being on the site and seeing that Lincoln actually lived here. He ran a general store, and he was a postmaster there, and he was there. This isn't somebody that I'm just reading about in a book. or online now, I guess. But he's somebody that was actually there, and I guess liken it to my Lord and Savior, that it'd be like going to the Holy Land and walking the land that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ walked on. It's those kind of things. It's going to not only New Salem, but coming into Springfield and looking at what's still there, his law office and the old state capitol where he gave his House Divided speech, all those things.
Yeah. It's hard, wouldn't you say? It's hard for anyone to fully appreciate a person like Lincoln and the travails Lincoln went through without having those historic structures that are related to him still standing.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm a huge advocate of preservation, of restoration of historic properties. And I always found that having them there, like a battlefield or a house or the old state cap, whatever, having them there adds a dimension to the story that otherwise we couldn't put in our heads ourselves. And so the idea that all of that is still standing in and around Springfield speaks volumes for anyone who wants to introduce their children or themselves to the story of Abraham Lincoln, don't you think?
You said it better than I could. Yes, absolutely.
There was a point in my life, I practiced law for 46 years. And at one point in time in my law career, I had most of my cases in Illinois, believe it or not.
Wow.
And one of them was tried in Charleston, which is a site where Lincoln tried a case.
Yeah.
One of his more interesting cases, by the way.
Yeah.
One in Danville, Vermilion County.
Yeah.
And the one in Charleston, we took to the Illinois Court of Appeals, and we argued it in the new state capitol. And then it went to the Supreme Court of Illinois in the new state capitol. And I'll never forget walking up to the courtroom to begin the arguments. And as you go up the steps in the capitol, there are the names engraved in plaques all the way up the steps of all the members of the Supreme Court of Illinois over the years. And I'll never forget, I got toward the top of the steps and I read Stephen A. Douglas.
Yep.
And it suddenly dawned on me, hell, I'm in the Supreme Court of Illinois, for heaven's sakes. And I don't know, maybe it's just me being just in love with history, but you pass something like that and you kind of go, man, isn't it neat to just be a part of a continuing story in this country.
Absolutely.
That he was. And all these others were, many of whom were common names to people who love the history of Illinois and what we then called the Old West. And to be just a part, you're arguing in front of the very same court that once had Stephen A. Douglas sitting on it.
Well, when you say Charleston, I immediately think of just a few weeks before Lincoln got on that train to go to Washington, D.C. He made a trip over to Charleston and rode just a little south of there to visit his stepmother for the last time. So when you say those things, and I can go in my mind and think about me going there and seeing that place and seeing where his mom and his stepmom and his dad are buried. So I've got that in my mind because I've been there. And so I can relate. And the last couple of weeks, I've been kind of following the timeline of Lincoln getting on that train at Springfield and traveling to Washington, D.C. and the places he stopped along the way because we're in that time period right now.
Yeah, right. And that train's, the old train station is still there in Springfield where he left.
Yes.
And I remember him telling Billy Herndon as he was getting on the train. Don't worry, Billy. When all this is over, I'll be back and we'll go on practicing law just like we did before.
That's exactly right. But a few days later, well, a couple weeks later, when he arrives in Philadelphia and he raises that flag, he kind of has an eerie premonition or prophecy where he says, I'd rather be assassinated on this spot. And so it was interesting that he would say that.
Yeah. That is another aspect of Lincoln. There's a mystique there. He did have deep and somewhat brooding thoughts that he would often express at times about the future, about him. But John, don't we find that often in the people on the frontier?
Yeah.
The melancholy, I've studied the frontier, Kentucky frontier, primarily, for a long time. And it's amazing how many people who you run across in history who survived the frontier have the same sort of melancholy that Lincoln did.
Yeah.
And don't you suspect, this is me now just rambling, I'm just suspecting here, that a lot of that comes from their frequent dealings with death. That so many people, family members, died prematurely, we would say very prematurely today, that all that cumulative dealings with the deaths of close family and friends somewhat precipitated that, created that. And none of them were immune from that.
No.
You look at the life of Daniel Boone, and you think of the sons he lost during the war, the Revolution. You look at those they lost outside of warfare, just disease, or at birth, and maybe lost the wife at birth.
Yeah.
It always gets me today in this modern time where we try to pigeonhole people by who they were, sometimes and often by race, and say, well, they were privileged, or this one had that and this one didn't. But I'll tell you, I'm the first one to say that no one had it good.
No.
In the years of the creation of this country, or in the years in the 19th century, nobody had it good. Nobody had it easy. All of them had it difficult, no matter what their station in life was.
Yes.
Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that Lincoln has this melancholy about him because look at all the people who died. As you articulated, how many people died in his family during his years growing up. That would make me blue too.
Well, there's a poem, and you may know this. I'm sure you do. That interestingly enough was published 3 years to the day that Anne Rutledge died, and it was called "The Suicide Soliloquy."
Yeah.
They don't know who published it or who wrote it, but it's pretty well suspected that Abraham Lincoln was the author of that poem.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. One of the most interesting things to visit, you mentioned New Salem, which is, folks, right outside of Petersburg, Illinois, is the little cemetery outside of Petersburg where Anne Rutledge is buried and where most of those New Salem residents Lincoln knew are buried.
Yeah.
And Anne Rutledge, for those of you who do not know, Anne was a person who Lincoln apparently desired to marry. The two of them apparently had a relationship. And then suddenly Anne dies. And so the story goes, Lincoln literally went into a deep depression over all that.
Yeah.
But anyway, there in that cemetery, in kind of the middle of the prairies, that's prairie country, folks.
Yes, it is.
It's as flat as a flitter,
My
the
homeland.
land. And there is Anne Rutledge's grave, and it is to understand the story. And really, any good book you pick up on the life of Abraham Lincoln will have that story in it. And I encourage everyone who's listening to this to go and get something, some book on Lincoln, something a written word about his life, and familiarize yourself with it, and then take yourself to Central Illinois and visit it.
Absolutely.
And it'll be I think for anyone, and particularly your children, but even adults who have not seen it, not had the privilege of being there. It's a moving story, if it's not a radically changing story for anyone who visits it.
And the message is that regardless of your station in life, where you come from, you can end up being president.
That's right.
And it's an amazing story. And I said that at the beginning, but I think parents really need to show that to their children. Anyone can come from any background. And if you really apply yourself, regardless of what you go through in life, you end up being president of the United States.
You can be.
It's possible.
It's possible. It's possible.
And Kent, one thing I'd like to mention too is back in 2005, Illinois and the city of Springfield opened the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and it's a phenomenal place. My mom still lives in Springfield, and I have a brother that lives there. And every time I go home, I have to go there. My wife knows we're going to go to the library and the museum and stop by because there's a new display, there's a new artifact that might be there. It's an interesting place to go. When it first opened, there was some criticism that it was Disneyland-ish kind of thing, but it's a phenomenal place and and it speaks to children and adults, and there's so much that you can glean from that about Abraham Lincoln. It's a great place to go. One other thing too, back in the 70s, when they had a lot of Lincoln things to go to, tourist attractions in Springfield, there was a little wax museum there. And of course, when the recession hit back in the 70s, those kind of things kind of dried up and went away. But interestingly enough, if you want to see those wax figures, they are down at Hodgenville at the Lincoln Museum there on the square down there in Hodgenville.
Yeah. As you know, John, and I would guess most of our listeners would know this, that the Witnessing History Education Foundation, which of course is the sponsor of these podcasts, came out in 2019 with a film entitled "In the Declaration, All Men Are Created Equal, Abraham Lincoln in Illinois."
Love that, yes.
And I take it you've seen it.
Yeah, and if you remember, I told you, I watched it and it kind of made me homesick.
Well, what's fun about it, everybody who's, again, listening, it was filmed entirely on location. And all the scenes and sights in that film were filmed where those events actually occurred. And that's from his first arrival at New Salem to his first attempt to run for the state legislature, his first attempt to enter the practice of law. All of those scenes are captured with high-end talent at the site where it all occurred. And in particular, there are a series of scenes of speeches given first by Stephen Douglas and then two by Abraham Lincoln, including the one where he accepted the Republican nomination for the United States Senate. And that was his famous House Divided speech.
Yep.
Those speeches in the film were all delivered in the same House of Representatives chamber where they were given in the old state capitol,
Yep.
and at the very same podium where Lincoln spoke and where Douglas spoke. And I really urge all of you who have not seen it to do so, and you can do so by going on the Witnessing History website, witnessinghistory.org, and you become a member free of charge. All of our films are made free to everybody. And then you can go on and click on the film. You can also go to the Witnessing History Education Foundation YouTube channel, and there you can also see the film on Abraham Lincoln in Illinois. And I would encourage you to do so. And I hope that after you do see it, that you would want to venture to Illinois with the family and take a look at the sites that are there.
I would echo what you just said there. Seriously, as someone who lived there and walked there and lived all that, again, it's phenomenal. You did a great job on that.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I don't know if you knew this or not, John, but I got a call from the president of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, and he asked me. He says, Kent, if the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library sponsored your film, would you object to that? I said, hell no. So right now, in all the public broadcasting affiliates in central Illinois,
wow,
when that film is being shown, it is the front end has about a 40-second spot where the head of promotions and at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library comes on and tells you why you should visit the Presidential Library. And I told him after I saw one, I said, I tell you what, I'm proud of the work we do, but something like that really made me proud of the work we do.
Absolutely.
Because that's as good an endorsement as you get anywhere. I mean, to have them do that. And so we have a real symbiosis, the foundation, with the Presidential Library. And I suspect over the years we're going to do a whole lot more work together.
Good.
Well, we've talked about Lincoln, and I could go on talking about Lincoln.
Let's do
for just about ever, and we can even come back to him if you want.
No.
But you are also, John, the chair of the Kentucky Semi-Quincentennial Commission of the American Revolution.
Yes,
and we're coming upon the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026.
Yep.
So, just tell me first of all, why is it important for Kentucky to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution?
Well, first off, congratulations. You were able to say semi-quincentennial. I've been working on that for a long time.
It's a tongue twister.
And it's going to be a little bit harder for people to say that. Bicentennial, that was easy. Everybody got that one. But this one's going to be a little bit harder. But Kentucky was very much involved, while we weren't actually a commonwealth or a state at the time. We have history that is involved in what happened almost 250 years ago. And so we need to get the word out and let people know that what was going on in Kentucky at that time and leading up to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one, I maybe you echo this too, that I think everyone should get out and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Yep.
And there's no person who ever walked this country who believed that more than Abraham Lincoln.
Uh-huh.
And that, of course, the title of the film we made was "In the Declaration, All Men Are Created Equal." When Lincoln had to respond to Stephen Douglas's committee in the United States Senate introducing the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which would have turned whether or not slavery in Kansas and Nebraska would be accepted or not into a popular referendum as opposed to following the Missouri Compromise line, which would have prohibited slavery in that territory. He wanted to turn it to a popular vote. And, of course, he was looking for votes. Yeah. He was an investor in a transcontinental railroad, and he wanted those votes to get that through. But Lincoln, in responding to Douglas, found that the phrase, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Lincoln immediately said, the framers of this country felt that, right? Yep. And they did. And what Lincoln goes so far, he finally, right before he decides to, run to get the nomination for the presidency, he gives a speech at Cooper Union in New York City. And what does he do? He goes through the members of the Congress of the Confederation who passed the Northwest Ordinance that prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin, present-day states. And he said, these people, before the Constitution, a majority of Congress before the Constitution agreed to this. And so that means the founders believed that the federal government could block slavery. And why don't we do it now? Yeah. We can't have him have popular sovereignty up there when Congress, has a duty now to stop that. And then Lincoln goes one step further. He looks at Congress after the ratification of the Constitution in 1787, when Congress reenacted the Northwest Ordinance under the new Constitution. And who signs that bill? But the President of the United States, who was then George Washington. Yeah. So all this stuff we hear today about Washington being this or that, and we don't need to do this with him. Look what he did with the Northwest Ordinance. And look what all those in Congress did. And it was a clear majority. And when Lincoln said this at Cooper Union, he brought the House down. Yeah. He brought the House down in New York City. And frankly, it's a speech that made him President of the United States, without any question. Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, his early learning, he was constantly learning about our history and our founding fathers. I mean, you read about that. And I said about his prophetic words at Philadelphia just a little bit ago, but when he was standing there getting ready to raise that flag, he said, I'm filled with deep emotion, finding myself standing here in this place. Yeah. Where all this wisdom was that put this country together. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what he said.
Absolutely.
I mean, he knew what that place was.
Yes. Yes. And think of the momentous events that occurred in that building. Yeah. Not only the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution. And what gets me, John, and I'm sure it does you, is the type of talk we hear today about the founders, these men. Yeah. That this was a racist, or this one was, or all this kind of stuff we hear today. No one, and why do we hear that? Is because no one either knows, or if he knows, pays a lick of attention to what actually happened. And isn't that our duty to understand our history, for crying out loud?
I think there's something said about that. Those who don't remember history or fail to repeat it.
Right. I mean, just to be a good citizen.
Yeah, yeah.
Just to understand what your role is as a citizen, to at least try to understand as much of it as you can.
Yeah.
And I know there's some of us who spend a lot of time on history, and no one's expecting everybody to do that. Many people don't have the resources, don't have at hand the material to do it. But it's all out there, and in public libraries, and it's all available now on the internet. I mean, and there's just tons of people who maybe have not a book in the house, but have the internet.
I've got a World Book Encyclopedia I'll loan out to somebody.
That's well worn,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Well, so I think it's incumbent upon Kentucky to celebrate like heck.
Yes.
The 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Yep.
I feel just like Lincoln did about it, and it's neat that we have these two things to talk about today because one is juxtaposed to the other. I mean, one leads to the other,
Yep.
and they both are great to talk about in tandem. Kentucky also has a great story in the Revolution.
Yes, they do.
We were actively fighting British invasions in what is now Kentucky throughout the war, and it was a very deadly war here, a savage war. But it was still those who sought to settle against Britain here, because Britain was financing many of the tribes, not all of them, but many of those tribes who invaded Kentucky with organized British troops, were the ones that the settlers had to deal with. And in the process, people like Daniel Boone, he lost 2 sons doing this, and he lost a brother. It was a very difficult time. I was talking with you before, John, about some other things that I like to talk about when we discuss the Revolutionary War in this part of the world. A lot of people, I think, believe that out here, what happened in the years leading up to the Revolution, the folks out here were not affected by that. And when I say this, I mean the plight of the people in Boston, for instance, Massachusetts, where they were putting up with what they would refer to as the coercive acts of Parliament, the intolerable acts of Parliament. And these acts mostly came about because Britain, in prosecuting the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, had racked up a debt that was just enormous, absolutely enormous. They didn't know how the heck they were going to pay the debt down. And what they sought to do was tax the colonies. Now, there was no representative from any of the colonies in Parliament. So there was no voice there to say, they can't pay that. No one. So they just pass it. And then when the colonies react to it strongly, Britain gets mad. I mean, I'm simplifying this, but that's what happened. Britain gets mad.
Yep.
And as when it gets mad, it puts on even heavier restrictions to the point where, in the end, Britain shut down the port of Boston. And there are the intolerable acts. I mean, even included things not only raising taxes on everything. I mean, every kind of paper and vellum imaginable is taxed. But they went so far, John, as to enact a law. We would call it a statute. It's an act of Parliament that made killing your children not a crime. Now, get that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry. That's where, there are some things you can almost tolerate. There are some things that are absolutely intolerable. And the reason they enacted that was because there were many children in Boston and in other parts of the colonies who were what we would call illegitimate. And they didn't want to take care of them. Britain didn't want to spend the money on them. They were broke. So when they don't want to spend the money on them, they just tell the colonists in the one provision of the Intolerable Acts that, killing your child or children is not a crime. Almost inviting them to do it.
Yeah.
That's how bad it got. And what's really interesting, in December, or in November, November 5th, 1774, a group of Virginians who had just defeated a Shawnee party, a very large virtual army, at the Battle of Point Pleasant, at the mouth of the Kanawha River, where it enters into the Ohio in West Virginia, had built a fort known as Fort Gower at the mouth of the Hocking River as it empties into the Ohio, right across the river from far northeastern Kentucky and West Virginia. And this is what those frontiersmen, and one of them was George Rogers Clark in the middle of this crowd. And here is what they resolved. They first said, "We will bear the most faithful allegiance to His Majesty King George III, whilst His Majesty delights to reign over a brave and free people. That we will, at the expense of life and everything dear and valuable, exert ourselves in support of the honor of His crown and the dignity of the British Empire. But," you're waiting for this.
Yep.
The first seems almost too hard to believe, but as the love of liberty and the attachment to the real interests and just rights of America outweigh every other consideration, we resolve that we will exert every power within us for the defense of American liberty and for the support of her just rights and privileges.
Yep.
Can you imagine that? It's always amazing. People in the East think that all of us out here are a bunch of sodbusters who don't know much. But no, this is 1774. James Harrod wouldn't settle what is now Harrodsburg, the first permanent settlement in Kentucky. Wouldn't settle that until the spring of 1774. And here we are in November 1774. James Harrod had just arrived in Kentucky. Daniel Boone is nowhere in sight. He won't be until the spring of 1775.
Yeah.
And here you get this sort of unbelievable language.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. Yeah.
Well, it didn't end there. Another group of Virginians in Fincastle County, Virginia, which is in the way upper Shenandoah Valley, meaning near Roanoke, between Roanoke and Lexington, Virginia. They got wind of this. And in January 20, 1775, just 2 months after the Fort Gower resolutions, they resolved, there are 15 delegates at this meeting, and they're led by Colonel William Preston and William Campbell, whose children married. We even have a colonel buried in the Lexington Cemetery, Colonel William Campbell Preston Breckinridge. So you can tell there were weddings between these Prestons and the Campbells. These are all Scottish Irish who came into Virginia and ultimately wound up in Kentucky. But here's what they resolved on January 20 in 1775. Again, this is 2 months before Daniel Boone settles Boonesboro. But if no public measures shall be proposed or adopted by Great Britain, and our enemies attempt to dragoon us out of those inestimable privileges which we are entitled to as subjects, and to reduce us to a state of slavery, we declare that we are deliberately and resolutely determined never to surrender them to any power on earth, but at the expense of our lives. Now that is about as tough as you get.
Yep.
Isn't that amazing?
It is, very much so.
I love the frontier, and it stuns you when you understand what those people were like.
Well, when you think about it too, after the Revolution, a lot of those Revolutionary War veterans were given property as payment.
Right.
And so there are Kentuckians today that are here because their ancestors, mine among them, even though my family ended up in Illinois, Daniel Robertson was a soldier that served under George Washington at Valley Forge. He was given some land, which is now in Christian County. He and his wife moved out there, and so some of my family came, and so others did too. There's a lot of families that came into Kentucky because they were given land as payment for being soldiers in the Revolutionary War.
That's exactly right. Do you remember where did he come from? What state? Your ancestor?
Virginia.
Virginia. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the unit he served in?
You would ask me that. I have it, not off the top of my head. But,
yeah. I'll tell you what. It is amazing how many people listening probably don't think they have a Revolutionary War ancestor. But I'll guarantee you'll probably find one.
Oh, yeah.
After all these years, even if you say, well, but some of my people came in from Central Europe or Eastern Europe, during the coal mining years, and we don't have any. Who did they marry in the years subsequent to that? Who are those children? And you related to them.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, there's no history like your own.
Oh, yeah.
And the history of a country is the history of all of us and all of our ancestors. And it's just the collection of the experiences of all of us. And I would encourage everyone to look into their own background as we head toward the semi-quincentennial of the Revolution.
Good job. and that's just it. When you love history like we do, and your listeners. When you look at your past and you look at the people that came before you, and you find out that one of your ancestral grandfathers served under George Washington at Valley, I mean, I had to sit there and look at that for a little bit and think, wow, that's incredible. That just went all over me that I can claim that. And and there, we have the sons and the daughters of the American Revolution that have all that information, and it's just incredible that when you find out that you actually you can claim ownership to some of that history.
Yeah, I'll never forget you, John. The Witnessing History Education Foundation has a newsletter that we send out every month, and it always has something historical to say at the beginning, a story of some sort. And in this edition, we wrote a story called "The Winter Soldiers," and it was about the Washington's army, the Continental Army, during the war, and these poor devils served through so many unbelievably difficult winters that they became known as the Winter Soldiers. If you can imagine, folks, in 1780, when we all hear a lot about Valley Forge and how bad and difficult that was, the men dying of disease all the time, and a very sad moment in the American story, but one of triumph, because at the end of Valley Forge, Washington's troops come out and defeat a British force at Monmouth Courthouse.
Yep.
But in 1780, they were in Morristown, New Jersey, during the winter. And this was known as the hard winter of 1780. And hard meaning, that was their term. If it was hard for them, man, it was really hard.
Yeah.
Because these people had exist in wintertime. They lived in houses that didn't have heat except for a fireplace. And so when they talk about a hard winter, they really meant hard. And it was so hard. In Morristown, there were over 120 inches of snow that winter. And it was so cold. This was not all at once, but over the course of the winter. And it was so cold that the bay between New Jersey and New York City froze to such an extent that the British could move artillery pieces across it, led by horses over the harbor in New York.
Heavy pieces.
Heavy pieces, heavy horses.
Yeah.
Now that is cold, folks.
Yeah.
And yet these guys endured that. And it is a real, just like Lincoln, it's a great story of perseverance, personal drive, a desire to be something better than where he came from. The story of the Revolution, the American story, is a story of the same kind of resolve, isn't it, John?
Yes, it is.
We're going to win this thing. I don't care how much it takes. Just like these frontiersmen write, we don't care about at the loss of life. Fine,
Yeah.
We're not going to surrender this.
Yep.
And it should be something imbued in all of us because we're Americans. Yeah. And a little brief note here. I think I wrote you back when you wrote to me about the Winter Soldiers, and told me about your ancestor and the Christian county roots that you have as a result. My ancestors all came from New York City, just Westchester County, just north of New York. And my ancestor became a captain in the 2nd New York Continental Line, which of course was in Washington's army. But he entered the service in 1775, fought at the Battle of Brooklyn, fought at the Battle of White Plains, and then they were both bad defeats, and then retreated across New Jersey to Pennsylvania and was at Newtown, and then crossed the Delaware and attacked Trenton, and then on Christmas night, 1776, and defeated a Hessian force at Trenton. Then was at the Battle of Princeton less than a month later, just really 2 weeks later. And this guy served, this is 1775, he goes in, this is 1776. He served throughout that war, went to, even went north, fought at the Battle of Saratoga, where, by the way, his cousins were British officers.
Wow.
Because New York was it was the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And then winds up at Yorktown. And that's Yorktown, 1781, October, when Cornwallis surrenders. And he goes home. And he had given all his windows to the cause because they were lead. And they used them for bullets. Yeah. And in 1786, he gets home in 1782. In 1786, he is accidentally kicked by a horse and killed. And you go, how can this be?
Yeah, all that.
All that. But I mention all that, all the travails of him, because he's not unlike all the rest of them, not unlike the ancestors of John here. They all suffered in that, in ways we can't even imagine. And I think it's high time we as Kentuckians and people everywhere in this country who are listening to this, and people listen to this all over the country, and frankly all over the world, because you can access us on YouTube. You can access us on our own website. But for all of you, and those of you who've been reading the newsletter, we are in the midst of producing a film called The Shot Heard Round the World, The Coming of the American Revolution. And it covers the years from colonial America until the Battle of Lexington and battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. And it gives you an understanding of the causes of the revolution and why the frontiersmen at Fort Gower and in Fincastle would say the things they did. And I think you all will be amazed at it. We're hoping to have that film finished, as long as we've got to keep raising the capital for it. But and we encourage you to give to the Witnessing History Foundation, Education Foundation, so that we can do things like that. But assuming we raise all the capital we need in that, it should be finished in the fall, late fall of this year. So anyway, Jon, listen, it's been fun having you here.
I've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed having you. And we want you to come back. When we get going with the commission, we'll have to make periodic reports on this, don't you think?
We'll do some semi-quincentennial moments.
Semi-quincentennial. So for those of you who want to know what the 250th anniversary actually sounds like in the language, it's semi-quincentennial.
Yeah.
So anyway, listen, thanks a million for coming here. I really do appreciate it, and it's been a lot of fun.
It has. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
You're mighty welcome. Goodbye, folks.
Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org. Download our documentaries and free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn.